Let's talk now to the president's top economic advisor, Kevin Hassett. Mr. Hassett, thank you for joining us this morning. You know, the president promised all through the campaign that prices would come down right away. Said they'd come down right away. Now he's saying, hang tough, it won't be easy. How high are prices going to go? How long will they stay there?
I actually saw it in this story that you just gave, George. There's kind of like a logical disconnect between the stories, the competing stories that your team is using to attack President Trump. On the one hand, you're saying that the countries are really angry and they're going to have to retaliate. On the other hand, you're saying that consumers are going to bear the costs and it's going to drive inflation up. But if U.S. consumers are bearing the costs, there's no reason for the countries to be angry. So the fact is the countries are angry and retaliating. And, by the way, coming to the table, I got a report from the USTR last night that more than 50 countries have reached out to the president to begin a negotiation. But they're doing that because they understand that they bear a lot of the tariff. And so I don't think that you're going to see a big effect on the consumer in the U.S. because I do think that the reason why we have a persistent long-run trade deficit is these people have very inelastic supply. They've been dumping goods into the country in order to create jobs, say, in China. And, George, also, I promise you I'll answer your questions directly and not filibuster, so I'll stop with that.
Well, where do you base your conclusion that you're not going to see an increase in prices? Just about every economist who's looked at this said you are going to see an increase in prices, including Goldman Sachs, including J.P. Morgan, including the chairman of the Federal Reserve.
Well, there might be some increase in prices, but the fact is that if there were going to be a heavy burden on the U.S. consumer, then this trade deficit that for 30 years we've seen, really since China entered the WTO, would be something that would have gone down. It would have gone down over time. It would have responded to the prices. The bottom line is that China entered the WTO in 2000. In the 15 years that followed, real incomes declined about $1,200 cumulatively over that time. And so if cheap goods were the answer, if cheap goods were going to make Americans' real wages, real welfare better off, then real incomes would have gone up over that time. Instead, they went down because wages went down more than prices went down. So we got the cheap goods at the grocery store, but then we had fewer jobs. And that's why President Obama and Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi and President Trump have come out saying we've got to come up with a better policy, a policy that treats our workers fairly compared to everybody else. And now President Trump, true to his word, just like he promised during the campaign, just like he put into his campaign platform, he's delivering on his word.
Right, but he also said prices were going to come down, and you just conceded the prices are going to go up. Also on Truth Social, the president retweeted a post that said the market drop was part of a deliberate strategy to force the Fed to lower interest rates. Is that the president's strategy? If not, why did he post it?
Yeah, the bottom line is the president has been talking about tariffs for 40 years, and this has been absolutely the policy that he's focused on in the campaign and throughout his political career. And, the cyclical cycle of the Fed, it comes and goes. That's a different matter. But this is President Trump's desired policy. He's been arguing for it ever since I think he was on The View 30, 40 years ago. And it's exactly, the baseline tariff is exactly what he put into the convention. So this is not a surprise for anyone.
Is it his strategy to force the Fed to lower interest rates, and that the market crash was part of that strategy?
We understand the Fed is an independent agency. We respect the independence of the Fed. But the president's allowed to have an opinion. Absolutely, the president's allowed to have an opinion. But there's not going to be any political coercion over the Fed, for sure.
So that is his strategy, tank the market so the Fed lowers interest rates? No. Well, you just said the president's allowed to have an opinion. Is that his opinion or not?
He's not trying to tank the market. He's trying to deliver for American workers. And I mean, what would you have him do? Again, real wages down 15 years in a row under the previous policy, and that's why Americans voted for him. They brought him in to turn the economy around for the American worker, and that's what he's focused on.
I'm just trying to get some clarity. Is that the president's strategy? Clarity. No, is that the president's strategy or not? He posted it. He said the strategy is for the markets to crash so the Fed lowers interest rates. Is that not a strategy
for the markets to crash? It is not a strategy for the markets to crash. It's a strategy to create a golden age in America for the American worker. That's his strategy.
J.P. Morgan says the risk of a recession has climbed to 60%. Your response?
We just had one of the stronger jobs reports I've seen in a long time. It was about 50% better than markets expected. It's the second one in a row. We've created already something like 10,000 auto jobs since President Trump took office. And I just got anecdotal word last night that auto plants are adding second shifts in the U.S. in order to respond to these tariffs.
Well, we've also seen auto companies like Stellantis say they're having layoffs.
We've got the data. We just got the data for last month and the month before. Both times manufacturing employment went up and auto employment went up. And again, we're looking at about 10,000 auto jobs, George. That's more than we got all of last year with Joe Biden.
That's looking back, but looking forward, Stellantis did say this week they were laying off workers.
The reason that they were starting it in the last 2 months was they anticipated the tariffs that were announced this week, and they were starting to ramp up in anticipation of that. I would expect that the jobs numbers, and I'll come back and talk to you about it when they come out, are going to go up by even more now that the tariffs are in place.
It's not just economists who are sounding the alarms. Republicans in the House and Senate have sounded some alarms as well, including Rand Paul, senator from Kentucky. I want to show what he wrote this week. He said, the truth is that tariffs are taxes. They don't punish foreign governments. They punish American families. When we tax imports, we raise the price of everything from groceries to smartphones, washing machines, and every other conceivable product. President's own vice president last term, Mike Pence, said this is the largest peacetime tax hike in U.S. history. Your response?
Well, we just saw that the Senate has agreed to budget rules that the House is negotiating with them now that is going to give the biggest tax cut in history in order to make space for these policies and to not have the runaway deficits that gave us all the inflation in the Biden administration. Then we've got an all-of-the-above approach where we're reducing taxes, reducing spending, reducing regulation, and imposing a baseline tariff around the world and hitting the harder actors, the tougher actors harder. That's what President Trump campaigned on. It's a sound policy. It's why people voted him into office, and it's what we're doing right now. We're delivering out the promises.
But a tariff is a tax increase, isn't it?
A tariff is a form of tax. It's a way that you collect revenue when you import products, yes.
And consumers pay that tax, correct?
No, because it depends on supply and demand, elasticity of supply and demand. And again, if you thought consumers are going to pay that tax, then you should be puzzled about why it is that countries are upset about it.
Well, I'm
asking you.
I'm focused on the consumers right now. You've conceded the prices are going to go up
because
of the tariffs.
They might go up some, but not nearly as much as you implied in your piece. And the reason is that the supply is inelastic in China. Again, I'll give you the simple example. If you have an apple tree that has 100 apples, and then you're paying $1 an apple, and then there's a 10-cent tax, then if you raise the price to $1.10, people reduce their demand, and so maybe they only demand 90 apples, but then you got 10 apples left, and so what are you supposed to do with the 10 apples that nobody wants? So what happens is the suppliers have to lower the price of apples in order to get back to 100 and 100. And so the question is supply inelastic or not? And I think that by seeing persistent trade deficits year after year after year, then we can say, yeah, supply is very inelastic.
So you're saying consumers are either going to have to buy less or pay more, but the tariff is a tax, as you just conceded.
No, what happens is that the supplier cuts his price so that the price is still $1, in my example.
Why did the president not include Russia on the list of countries who are facing tariffs?
There's obviously an ongoing negotiation with Russia and Ukraine, and I think the president made the decision not to conflate the two issues. It doesn't mean that Russia, the fullest of time, is going to be treated wildly different than every other country.
But Russia is one of the only countries, one of the few countries that is not subject to these new tariffs, aren't they?
They're in the middle of a negotiation, George, aren't they?
Well, I'm asking a different question. Why? And I just want to know why.
Would you literally advise that you go in and put a whole bunch of new things on the table in the middle of a negotiation that affects so many American and Ukrainian and Russian lives?
Negotiators do that. Negotiators do that all the time.
No. It's not appropriate to throw a new thing into these negotiations right in the middle of it. It's just not.
So you are conceding that Russia is not paying any new tariffs, unlike many of our allies, including Europe, Canada, Mexico.
Russia is in the midst of negotiations over peace that affects really thousands and thousands of lives of people, and that's what President Trump's focused on right now.
How do you respond to Fed Chairman Jerome Powell saying we're going to see higher inflation and slower growth?
We saw a really, really strong jobs number last time, and we've seen inflation coming down. I think inflation comes from runaway spending that is monetized by the Fed. That's what Jay Powell and Joe Biden gave us last term. And then I saw the Fed kind of saw the error in its ways after a while and started to tighten and help get in control under inflation. And what we're seeing now on the Hill is reduced spending. And so I don't think that the inflationary spiral that we saw last term is a high risk right now.
Finally, where do things stand with TikTok? You saw in our report that China has backed out of any negotiations, any approval of a possible sale because of these tariffs. Is that true? Where is it going to go from here?
There are ongoing TikTok negotiations, but I haven't been involved with them. I've mostly been involved in negotiating the reconciliation package with the Senate and the House and with the tariffs over the last couple of weeks. So I can get you an update on that, but it's not something I've been working on this week.
But they are tied together at this point, aren't they?
I would have to get back to you on that.
And do you expect?
I've heard that there are negotiations ongoing and that there are a number of offers, but I have not been read in on what the latest status of that.
And have you seen any evidence that China is not going to follow through with their imposition of a counter tariff?
No. No, again, I have not been involved in Chinese negotiations this weekend. But there are more than 50 countries reaching out and trying to negotiate this new status with the president.
Kevin Hassett, thanks very much for your
Good
time.
to see you, George.